Man on the internet, do we know where Kaido was born, and do you think we could get a hint of his lineage? So we do, sort of. Kaido was born 59 years ago, which is 4 years after the events of this chapter, but we don't know exactly where he was born. Just that he ended up in the Vodka Kingdom as a child, and while there was a theory that Kaido could be related to Harald because the portrait of Harald is strikingly similar to Kaido's face, that theory it's no longer quite as strong as it once was, or anywhere near it. So there was this idea that Kaido was the third brother of Harudjn and Loki who was tossed away, and this was obviously before we knew that Loki was literally tossed away. And it's looking a lot less likely now that we're here in this moment of time. It's very, very difficult to see a direct Kaido connection being brought in, despite the fact that Kaido is very likely related to the giants of Elbaf with his ancient giant blood, and at some point we are going to find out when that schism occurred. It just might not be right here and now. Loki being yeeted out the window before he was 5 minutes old is already the top 5 saddest backstory. There's definitely a few backstories on par with this. Like I would say the baby 5 being born to a mother who didn't even care enough to name her beyond the order of her birth, baby number the 5, and then subsequently abandoned her in the woods. That was a pretty rough one as well. But I think the really truly tragic thing about Loki's story is just how easily this all could have been avoided. Because the only person who seems actively disgusted by Loki is Estrid. There's a couple of servants and soldiers and stuff who see baby Loki and they are nowhere near as bothered by him, or arguably even bothered at all. So as it's portrayed in the manga, this is a very Estrid exclusive issue. And if anyone else of note aside from Estrid was there at the time of his birth, then they would not have let this happen. If Harald was there, there is no way that he would have let Estrid throw Loki away. And to Harald's further credit, from the short little flashback we've seen of him earlier, he does seem like the only one who accepted Loki. And I'm actually really keen to see Ida's reaction to seeing Loki. She's very supportive of the concept of Loki in this chapter, but I'm not sure if that's before or after she's actually seen him. But I would expect Ida's response to be quite heartwarming, and perhaps even encroaching on that motherly void left by Estrid. But Loki is a man who was rejected by his mother, rejected by his brother, by his entire civilization, by his idol Roxy Zebek, and even rejected as a marriage partner by Charlotte Lola, a woman who rather infamously asks every man she meets to marry her, and yet Loki is the only person she has ever refused. And I do think this makes the beginning of Elbaf that much more powerful in retrospect, because after having faced this lifetime of nothing but rejection, all of a sudden here is a Luffy who accepts Loki without even a second thought. Luffy doesn't need or even want to know a single thing about Loki. He's going off vibes alone, and those vibes are telling Luffy that he's managed to find a real good guy out here in the heart of hell. And I'm not sure if Loki is going to quite realize that until Luffy sees his eyes for the first time. And instead of being afraid or disgusted, Luffy's going to be all like, "Kakoi," with stars in his eyes, so cool. When King Harald brought peace, education, and diplomacy to Elbaf, the fanbase thought that Harald was a simp for the world government. Turns out he was a simp for somebody else. So me, I'm that person, not the simp or the person being simped for, but the person who thought that Harald had a thing going on with the world government. For most of Elbaf, I have been quite suspicious of Harald, and there are still some things left to work out, like his connection to the Holy Knights and why they seem to have this begrudging respect for him. But initially the idea was that Harald was purposely demilitarizing Elbaf, either because it would make it easier for the world government to command them, or because Harald didn't want to continue that cycle of war that he knew his people were destined to play a major role in. But the truth is definitely a lot better than whatever the crap we were thinking at the time. Harald wanted prosperity in every sense. He never wanted Elbaf to lose that lineage as warrior culture, but he wanted to incorporate and learn from what every other culture excels at as well. And I didn't mention this in the chapter review, but one of the many civilizations that Harald visited as part of this endeavor happens to be Wano. We can see him sailing those very familiar waves and even speaking to a group of what appear to be samurai. And my first thought for this was that these sailors could have been the group of samurai that left to found the Shimotsuki village in East Blue, but looking it up, that happens much later on, about 15 years later. And according to the timeline in this chapter, this happens about 70 years ago. So no Shimotsuki village. However, it means that Harald may very well have met Kozuki Sukiyaki. At this time, Sukiyaki would have been around 11 years old, and Harald goes on to tell that he also visited Fishmen Island as well, and speaks of the birth of Prince Neptune, which is a good reminder that now King Neptune is actually 70 years old. I always think he's younger, but it also makes a lot of sense because his whole gag is that he is a super powerful warrior, but he can never fight because he's a really bad back, ow. And I'm actually quite stunned at just how easily Harald appears to have made contact with two of the most difficult to access civilizations on the planet. And Oda didn't choose these at random either. Elbaf, Wano, and Fishmen Island form a trio of isolation with direct connections to the ancient kingdom. And two of those islands were even chosen to house ancient weapons. And Elbaf could have been the third, by the way. They may have initially had your anus but lost it due to something world government. Maybe we'll even see it. I have to imagine that the group of shadowy giant overlords are the ones who live in the heaven realm. If they are in the heavens, then they probably act as gods and can rule over kings, which begs the question, is the heaven realm basically like a giant version of Marijois? I mean, they do seem to act like giant world nobles, and even the ways that their silhouettes are drawn matches how Oda has depicted miscellaneous world nobles in the past. And I guess you would think that if they do still exist, then they would have to be in the heaven realm, and it may be because of their influence that Elbaf currently has no king. Ever since Harald's death, the throne has been vacant, potentially because the shadowy overlords cannot accept Harudjn's impurity, disgusting, or Loki's desire to destroy, checks notes, everything, because that's very counterproductive to maintaining the traditions of Elbaf as well. But also when we see them, the establishing shot is in the village of the Sun Realm, so they may not be heaven dwellers, or if they are, they've come down from heaven to meet with Harald. But either way, they could end up being the ones responsible for Harald's murder. If they see Harald as a man taking Elbaf too far from its traditions, then they may have seen fit to see him killed in an incident related to, or even completely independent of the Holy Knights. I think the shadowy figures that forbid/allowed Harald to marry were representative of culture. They were faceless, yet they had more power than kings. So I definitely see where you're coming from, and I quite like this idea from a perspective of, artistic wankery. But I do think it's one of those ideas that might be a bit too abstract for One Piece. Especially when these same abstract faceless voices then arrange Harald's marriage to Estrid. They directly introduce him to his bride. So I think the shadowy figures are more literal, even though I do like the cultural reading, and yeah, that could be wrong. But given that everyone who meets Ida seems to love her and the villagers even enthusiastically offer to let her live with them, I've got to believe that this is an actual third party of traditionalists enforcing the laws rather than a wider representation of the idea of culture itself. The problem I have with Harudjn this chapter is that he legit never gave Loki a chance at being a brother to him. And to be fair to Harudjn, we don't know if he ended up giving Loki a chance or not. We just see him being rather unwilling at first, and I kinda get it. Throughout Harudjn's life so far, blood has been such a big deal. Everyone's always talking about his unique blood from his impure mother. So unique in a not very good way at all. And as a result of that, I imagine that Harudjn has probably taken quite a bit of pride in who he is. So I can see him being unwilling to accept anyone who doesn't share his mother's DNA as well, because that is a very important factor to who he is. But from what we've seen in previous slivers of flashback, it looks like it was actually Loki being a complete dickbag to Harudjn, always physically beating up his older brother and insulting Harudjn's mother. And that, in retrospect, might be a bit of jealousy. It's fair to say that Loki probably has some mummy issues. So seeing Harudjn having this loving mother, mate, that is unacceptable. So we need to find a way to twist that and make this loving mother concept a not good thing. But what does give me quite a bit of hope for Harudjn is that I doubt he's ever judged Loki just based on his appearance. Harudjn doesn't like Loki because he can't accept a brother who wasn't born from his mother Ida, and that is very different to, say, seeing Loki's eyes and disowning him. Loki knowing when Big Mom swapped chiffon with Lola was foreshadowing of Loki being able to tell the difference between Shanks and Shamrock even blindfolded. He is able to see the different characteristics behind the same face. So this is 100% correct. After being rejected by Lola, the Big Mom Pirate's trying to pass Chiffon off as her twin sister Lola, which is a pretty depressing indictment of how Chiffon and Lola were seen within the family, but there wasn't really much to them beyond their outer shells. And from their perspective, we basically had doubles in our whole Kate card collection, so it was fine to trade one of them away. Although it is kind of funny that in the end, Lola went on to marry Gotti, someone who initially mistook her for Chiffon. But I am keen to see exactly what it is that Loki noticed though. Maybe it was a reaction to seeing his eyes. Or maybe he just does have a gift to see people's inner selves, which is the same gift that Luffy is using to read Loki right now. And at the very least, yes, this situation would have taught Loki an important lesson about appearances, which we've seen him apply to meeting Shamrock and instantly knowing that it was not Shanks. But since we're going back back on it, I'd also like to note Nami's reaction to hearing that Loki was a prince. She states, "A prince? Ooh la la," which is definitely the reaction that Sanji would have wanted to hear's heritage, but instead he got slapped in the face because he did some bad things. And someone else in the comments also brought up Harald's marriage versus Loki's proposal, and that if Harald wasn't allowed to marry Ida, another giant, then there is surely no way that the Council of Ominous Silhouettes would have allowed Loki to marry a human. And to that I say, look, that's probably correct, unless Harald was successful in changing the culture by the time of this proposal. But what I would also say is that Loki is the kind of man who is very, very unlikely to live by rules dictated to him by another. And so if Lola had said yes, then Loki would have Leluciaed all of Elbaf's culture to make it happen if need be. At the end of the chapter, Estrid is already said to have died due to ill health. You must have missed it. So at the end of the chapter, it actually says that she collapsed due to ill health. Not that she died right then and there. She is still alive. And in fact, we know for a fact that she didn't die because the very next panel is her speaking all of her nonsense prophecy words. So you must have missed it. But let's talk about this whole Estrid illness thing while we're here though. Something about it strikes me as a little bit similar to when Orochi couldn't stop shivering after the Hour of Legends and after hearing Toki's prophecy. And both of these cases are very self-inflicted illnesses. And in Estrid's case, very, very convenient, I must say. I don't like Estrid. I might even go so far as to say that I'm glad she'll be dead by the next chapter. But I'm also not going to overlook what Oda did here. Sneaky, sneaky story, man. The character of Estrid was inserted. She served a mechanical purpose. And now she's being disposed of in a somewhat unbelievable, like literally unbelievable. She's making up an illness for herself to suffer. And so she's being disposed of in a very convenient and quick way so that she has no further impact on anything. Because keeping her around only causes problems for the story that Oda wants to tell from here on out. And you know, I'm going to give Oda a pass this time because I don't think many people want to see Estrid stay around for much longer. But every now and then, One Piece can sometimes feel like a bit of a character factory, where characters are built, used, and immediately disposed of, especially in flashbacks. And while it is extremely efficient storytelling, it does sometimes break the immersion for me. Because in the case of Estrid, I don't see her as a character so much as I do a narrative tool. The biggest complaint I have with Elbaf is they've done such a bad job of making it seem populated in any way. So I don't necessarily disagree with this feeling, and I do think this is a byproduct of the aforementioned character factory approach, where we only encounter exactly what we need at the exact time we need it and then get rid of it. And something I really wish I had right now was a much deeper sense of the population of Elbaf and all of the different villages on the Sunworld. But this is something that I think Oda has been a bit afraid to get into too much ever since Wano, because Egghead Island also had this problem to a much larger degree. That island had a whole population of researchers and cool robot assistants and everything, but we never got to know a single thing about any of them. There was this whole civilization we encountered, and when I think back on Egghead Island, it's like they never existed. And I bet that there's people watching this video right now who forgot that there was a population at all on Egghead Island outside of the Vegapunks. And my theory for why this is because it's a bit of a battle scar from Wano. Oda spent such an awfully long time fleshing out the residents of that island as best he could, and he did a great job, but it took so much time that I think Oda now has an internal policy of streamlining things to only the most important characters, which is why it can sometimes feel like Elbaf as an island has a population of only like 15 giants and 10 kids. Although look, honestly, if that is the biggest complaint I have about Elbaf or Egghead Island, then things are running pretty damn well, because craving more time with the side content is just the sign of an already great game. Here's hoping Liam mentions the fact the Owl Library was probably Harald's life's work. So the Holy Knights were surprised to see a library, so it is likely a new addition as a result of Harald. Of course, it could also be a heavily expanded version of something that already existed, because Biblo, the chief owl librarian, predates Harald by ever so many centuries that nobody even knows where Biblo came from. But Harald in this chapter has shown a great care and passion for writing and preservation, which does seem to be building up to a passion for librarianness. Ida worked at a circus. Harudjn worked for Bucky. Very interesting coincidence. Yep, very much following in his mother's footsteps there. But little does Harudjn know that he is currently serving under an even bigger clown, as Harudjn still hasn't seen the full potential of our new sun god Luffy. Internet man, it seems people have figured out they have a higher chance of their comment being viewed if they call you Internet man. Alright, so I have noticed this, and I think it's because people who call me internet man on average just seem to have more interesting things to say, or on average spot more things that I've missed. So if someone starts their sentence with internet man, then more attention must be paid to it. Hey, man on the internet, won't Oda's introduction of the North Star kind of ruin the whole idea of only being able to navigate the Grand Line through log poses? So this North Star business is almost treated like a throwaway line in the chapter, but it does go against quite a bit of what we've been taught about navigating within the Grand Line and the New World. But at no time has it ever been stated that the log pose and the eternal pose are the only way to navigate. And the North Star is also not the first alternate navigation tool that we've seen from the Giants. Earlier on in the arc, we were introduced to Painter, the rainbow making tool, which is based on sunstone, a substance believed to have been used by Vikings for navigation in the Middle Ages. But we've known that there has to have been some alternative to navigation for quite some time now, just because the log pose and the eternal pose only ever point forward. You can only use them to get further into the Grand Line and into the New World, but you cannot use them to backtrack. Which isn't a problem for the Straw Hats because we're only ever going forward, but it is a huge issue for the rest of global sea travel, and short of a vessel having an eternal pose for each of the estimated 20 million islands in the One Piece world, we do need another alternative for actually getting to a place. So I suppose one way to look at it would be that log poses and eternal poses are for safety. They give you the guaranteed path to the next island, and so reduce the risk that you'll be caught straying too far into some other weather phenomena. But also within the Grand Line and the New World, the weather changes so rapidly that it's probably not always or even commonly possible to see the stars even if you do know what you're looking for. And it should be said that North Star is what the kanji literally says, but Harald calls it the pole star, which actually exists in our real life. They're stars approximately aligned with the axis of rotation of an astronomical body, which is why it appears that they never move whilst everything else is spinning around them. And it's a very interesting thing for people who are in far too deep with One Piece theories to hear, as a theory involving pole stars and a concept known as pole shift is one of the more prominent and compelling ideas behind what's going to restore this planet to its pre-flood state, and even an idea that leads us to an estimate of where the One Piece itself is located, given that our ever so familiar Log Town just so happens to be part of a series of islands known as the Pole Star Islands. So if you want to know more about that, and I think you do, then I would highly recommend checking out this video if you're interested.